Hello, everybody. It is Friday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, in for Christopher Carter on today's episode of the North Shore Drive podcast with Brian Batko, our Steelers insider. Chris is in Indianapolis. We had a few technical difficulties recording Friday's show, and now he is on his way to Louisville to cover Pitt basketball. So fear not, Chris will be back on Monday, but you're here with me today. We're going to be talking Steelers quarterbacks and whether there is division in the Steelers front office like there was in 2021 over Ben Roethlisberger and how that might be influencing the conflicting reports we're seeing on Justin Fields, Russell Wilson, maybe some of these other free agent and trade options. We're also going to talk about NFL trades and some guys who are available, have requested trades, that have teams seeking trades. Could the Steelers be interested in any of those guys? Are the Steelers in a position to be making trades and possibly giving up draft capital? We're also going to talk about pre-combine, during the combine interviews, some guys the Steelers have talked to during that process. So lots to get to today, Brian. Let's just dive right into it on the quarterbacks. Russell Wilson, Justin Fields is the decision we've been talking about for months. And you were asked in your mailbag today whether there is dissension in the ranks, because we'll see a report from Jay Glazer, for example, who people know is fairly plugged in with Mike Tomlin and his thinking on the world. Or our own Jerry Dulac, has his own reporting, and sometimes that reporting doesn't match up in terms of where the outcome is going to be. And I think people then say, oh, you can't believe anything. I think it's just a matter of who your sources are, Brian, and there may be some sources within the Steelers that are saying different things because there is some division in this front office. What's your read on that situation and whether that's kind of the way it was like in 2021 when we know that Art Rooney wanted to bring Ben Roethlisberger back for his final season? We know Kevin Colbert maybe was a little more lukewarm on that idea. I don't know. Did I set that up well in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jerry's reporting on this has been pretty clear for a while now. He's been saying that there's not necessarily 100% accord within the Steelers on what to do at quarterback, and that's not like a sign of dysfunction or anything. I think that's a pretty natural way that any operation works, right? Regardless of the walk of life that you're in and what you do, the main decision makers at your company or your media outlet or whatever might have some different ideas about the overall vision, and that's why people have sit-down meetings and Zoom calls, and in the NFL, chalk talks or whatever about in different, units split up into meetings to discuss the best way to move forward. So, yeah, and I know that some fans and readers have asked, like, oh, what does Jerry mean? Like, Mike Tomlin wants one guy and Arthur Smith wants the other guy. It's probably not that simple. There are other people inside an NFL franchise who have opinions that aren't coaches. Could be people in ownership, could be front office executives whose word carries some weight. So, I mean, these are natural things, and it's not the end of the world. And yes, it does harken back to, I think we can pin down where Arthur Smith stands on this. I don't necessarily know how much juice he has, but he's, I think, pretty clearly prefers Justin Fields and has going back to last season. But yeah, I got asked, like, is it similar to 2021 where kind of the three main brass of the Steelers were kicking around the Ben Roethlisberger idea, and they were pretty wishy-washy on it for a month and change after that 2020 season and collapse of whether to bring them back or not. And I think in the end, we could pretty clearly see that Kevin Colbert wasn't really for it. Art Rooney II was for it. Mike Tomlin, maybe for the sake of his longevity as the Steelers coach, just kind of washed his hands of it or didn't really get implicated one way or the other. But I think it's different this time around for a couple reasons. I mean, number one, Russell Wilson, I think he's got some level of popularity here. I think the Steelers very much liked how he represented the organization last year, and he's probably going to be on the stage in Canton someday talking about his Super Bowl run with the Seahawks and all the other records that he's going to amass. But he's not arguably the best offensive player in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers football club. He's not a guy who helped bring 2 Lombardi trophies here. That made things inherently messier with Ben. The other big difference that I didn't mention in the mailbag, Adam, is this year, as you alluded to at the top, I mean, there are other factors at play. Justin Fields could have a team fly in out of left field and give him an offer he can't refuse. And that's, that's his right now as an unrestricted free agent to look into all that. I think it's less likely, but Russell Wilson could get the same kind of deal there, that a team is like, hey, he just didn't have the right structure around him with the Steelers. He can still sling it. Let's bring him here to either be our starter or maybe a bridge to a guy that we're going to draft. So they don't have all the leverage. Back in 21 with Ben, they had pretty much all the leverage. It wasn't a question of Ben going somewhere else. Maybe some of the most far-fetched ideas out there posited that, but it was just, is he back here or is he done? And I think that made things a little easier. And obviously they did plot a path forward with Ben, and it took some financial considerations by all involved. But this time around, yeah, I just think it's a situation that's got more moving parts to it. And even if there are people who are Team Russ or Team Fields, it's not entirely like that. But it is yet another example of, people at the top of the Steelers are maybe in agreement or not in agreement over what they should do at quarterback. And it's the first big domino to fall in an offseason for them yet again.
Well, I think another big difference too, Brian, is that there was never like a serious alternative to Ben Roethlisberger presented other than, we're going to start over maybe with someone we drafted or whoever's on the free agent market, but we never got into those conversations the same way. There's two, I think, I would say there's Fields here, there's Wilson here. So you have two, serious options. And then there are, I think, more guys that intrigue you available either in free agency or the trade market. The two names we talk about a lot are Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford. I still think that those outcomes are unlikely, but you at least have to talk through them and consider them as options. And then in the context of what you're saying, of you don't have total control over where Russell Wilson and Justin Fields end up like you did with Ben. So it's just it's a messier situation overall. I think even if it's less messy in terms of the optics and the relationship with a franchise cornerstone.
You could have total control if you just go to Justin Fields' agent tomorrow and say, okay, we're just going to give you an insane clear-cut starting quarterback deal. He'd probably take that. But that doesn't really make sense for the Steelers either. I think it's pretty clear that's not how they've been operating under Omar Khan, at least. And, in some ways, this situation is similar to the following offseason, 2022. Now, it was different because Mason Rudolph had been collecting dust for the most part since the 2019 campaign, where he was up and down with Duck Hodges and vice versa. But they had every opportunity to sign Mason early and say, okay, no, succession plan, we're seeing it through now. Post Ben, it's Mason's time. As we know, they did not do that. They went into free agency, targeted Mitch Trubisky, got that done, go and draft Kenny Pickett. And, Rudolph circled back eventually anyway. So, I mean, he didn't have nearly the same, market value as Fields and Wilson do this year, but it is at least somewhat of a precedent of this, why the Steelers aren't, blowing away one of these guys with an offer right now when they have the inside track to get a guy who was on their team last season. And I think Mason too probably wanted to take a look around at that time. And, even last year, they could have done that with Rudolph, and they did not. They went completely in a different direction with Russ, trading Kenny, trading for Justin, and Rudolph is able to test the open market and didn't hit some of those wildest projections that were getting thrown out there. I guess week 17 when he was coming off those first two starts and wins against the Bengals and the Seahawks. So it's just another February and March of Steelers quarterback days of our lives, where we're trying to figure out I think somebody, and I don't know if it was in my mailbag or maybe someone else who emailed me about the Palace intrigue of what's going on behind closed doors. In some ways, it's extremely high stakes, right? It's the most important position on your team and in the league and probably in sports. But on the other hand, it's almost kind of low stakes, because I don't think any of us are delusional enough to think one of these guys is a clear-cut all-pro and the other one is going to sink your season. So it's the best of bleak options right now, because the best quarterbacks in the league are locked up with their team for next year and beyond.
Yeah.
Or they're 1 through 5 in the draft.
Yeah, the Steelers are just in that position where, I mean, this is what you get. This is what you have to deal with. And you are, on some level, discussing different flavors of the same ice cream.
That's a good way to
Brian,
put it.
yeah. Brian, I wanted to ask you, you brought up that there's just some different faces in that front office now. Obviously, Omar Khan's been elevated to general manager. Arthur Smith, I think, is intriguing because he's not like Matt Canada was in 2021, where he was a first-time NFL coordinator. I think it'd be fair to say that Arthur Smith is a little bit stronger coordinator, has a stronger voice as a former NFL head coach, a guy who's had success in this league. What's your read on how they are establishing themselves as voices in this front office? Not necessarily who do they prefer and how does that matter, but just your read on their influence and whether it's growing and is compared to some of these other names we talked about that were involved in that 2021 decision.
Right. Hard to say for sure, but I think just when you hear Art Rooney II or Omar Khan talk about Arthur Smith, yeah, I feel like he's held in a little higher regard than Canada was, and rightfully so. And I also think that was the case when they hired him. He wasn't just some random college coach, no offense, but I mean, he was a recently departed head coach from the Falcons whose time there ended, I mean, decisively, but it wasn't like an obvious, okay, this guy's got to be gone. I mean, they didn't even get to 500, but there are a lot of other external factors there, which brings me to the other side of that coin. While I do think Arthur Smith is pretty respected around the league and generally viewed as a sharp guy who knows what he's doing and handles himself well, and that probably would lend itself to having a little bit more sway in these roster decisions. Botching the quarterback spot is pretty much what sealed his fate in Atlanta. I mean, it wasn't like it was a dumpster fire of dysfunction with the Falcons. It seemed like he was running a pretty tight ship overall, but they just couldn't get it right under center. They were pretty much Steelers South in that way. They dipped into that 2022 quarterback class, albeit not in the first round, credit to them, but Desmond Ridder in the third was not the guy. The Marcus Mariota thing didn't work. If anything blew up in Smith's face, it was that there was some back and forth going on with those two, and he's been pretty open about that now that he's in Pittsburgh. So how much do you even really want him? I don't think meddling's the right word, but just how much do you want to lean on his opinion there? And if you're Arthur Smith, maybe you figure, hey, at this stage of my career, if I stake myself to Justin Fields, a guy who's got really everything you'd want in a quarterback and just hasn't put it all together yet, and that's my undoing in Pittsburgh, I can sleep better at night, and I can live with that more than I could kind of staking myself to Desmond Ridder and kind of a revolving cast of other characters at quarterback when he was in Atlanta.
Brian, where does Art Rooney fall on involved owner? On the involved owner spectrum in the NFL, I think Jerry Jones is probably the quintessential example of way too involved. And then I think Art Rooney has done a nice job of branding himself as just kind of the owner and the steward of the family business and that type of thing. But it seems increasingly like every time we have one of these thorny conversations about what the Steelers are going to do, with a big call that he has a heavy hand. Is that just a perception from looking at the quarterback situation because it is so important and it is, so tied to the future of the franchise in any given year? And then he's not really concerned with what they're doing at linebacker or what they're doing at other positions? Or is he more involved than maybe the public perception he would like to maintain?
I mean, I don't know if I'd say heavy hand. That might be a little strong, but yeah, I mean, I think Jerry's done a lot of reporting on kind of how he stepped in, so to speak, with the Matt Canada firing a couple years ago, which was very un-Steelers like. So I think when you are breaking from decades and decades of precedent, might need an owner to stamp that one or even suggest it to begin with to go down that avenue. Yeah, I mean, I would look at it generally as, yes, he's probably not telling Mike Tomlin to check out this potential left guard from Northern Iowa in any given draft. But, stuff that deals with, yes, the quarterback position would probably be one area on the roster that rises above. Guys who've been around and cemented their Steelers legacies like Cam Hayward and TJ Watt, I imagine he'd be a little more involved with those kind of decisions. Or if there's maybe a disgruntled player who's causing some issues, then maybe there's some ownership and involvement. I don't know if it's like a trip to the principal's office or how exactly that goes, and then certainly, the coaching status contract of Tomlin in any given year that's relevant. Of course, that's going to run through him. So I believe him when he says publicly all the time that it's, these are Mike's areas of expertise. I let my head coach be the head coach, and that is what you pay him for. And on the flip side, Mike Tomlin usually says the right things too about how Art Rooney II is his boss and he works for the Rooney family. So I don't think there's anything, like frayed behind the scenes with any of that kind of stuff. He's made the rounds again this offseason and, weighed in on various failings of the team and what they have to do better. So he's left no doubt that the quarterback position is really where it starts. So if there's any hair that you would potentially split, I guess it would be anecdotally. It feels like when Mike Tomlin gets asked about it big picture, he kind of harps on quarterback mobility. And when Art Rooney II talks about it big picture, he kind of harps on someone who can read a defense and maybe play a more traditional style. But it's not always apples to apples there. I wouldn't take an 8 out of 10 quality quarterback, who's a pocket passer over a 4 out of 10 quality quarterback because he's mobile. That doesn't really make sense either.
Brian, we're going to get into the NFL trade market. I'd say an uncommon amount of names seem to be available either via requesting trades or teams
also might have said that backward, but I think people knew what I meant.
Yeah, no, you're good. So we're going to get into the NFL trade market here in a second. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Edgar Snyder and Associates. Whether you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder has helped injury victims for over 40 years, recovering more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one has been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We are back on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm Adam Bittner in for Christopher Carter, talking to Brian Batko about the NFL trade market. Brian, there's some names we've talked a lot about already. Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel. Even talked a little bit about Deebo Samuel last offseason during the Brandon Ayuk endless drama there. He was kind of like the 1B of that conversation of if the 49ers moved on from somebody, maybe it would be Deebo. Now that conversation has turned up, but there's other names out there as well. Jonathan Allen, Jaire Alexander, Myles Garrett, famously. I'm going to get into him more in a little bit. But Brian, do you imagine the Steelers being in the mix for any of these guys, or are you watching those situations more closely than maybe we have talked about on these podcasts and on the postgazette.com website so far?
I think it's a case by case basis, and I think what's interesting about it is it seems like this offseason, more than any I can recall, Adam, it's this growing trend of, one of the national NFL insiders reports player X has been granted permission to seek a trade by his team. And it's like, that used to be reserved for kind of the heaviest hitters in the NFL. And I don't know if it's just getting reported on more because of the level of interest in the league, or if more agents are kind of seeing the trick, and it's like a trickle down effect of like, oh, we're seeing this guy, his agent's actually going to go out there and kind of be the intermediary between teams. And it can be beneficial for all parties if he gets team B to agree to pay him more than his current team, and then they can come together on compensation. And I guess it's sort of efficient that way, but it's also not always practical because that is a lot of puzzle pieces that need to fall into place to get that done. Example, Exhibit A, Brandon Ayuk last year. The Occam's razor was the case. He just signed an extension with the 49ers rather than, getting another team involved and then another contract negotiation involved. So I do think it's something that's growing. And there's some really not bad players, but like replacement level guys at this point are going this route. Like Jermaine Pratt, the linebacker from the Bengals, who the Steelers see twice a year. I saw that he's been given permission to seek or requested a trade or whatever. It's like, all right, guys, we might be losing the plot a little bit here. When Myles Garrett does it, it's one thing, but Jermaine Pratt, like, do we need to make this a thing? Like, just go about it quietly. If the Bengals trade you, whatever, we'll hear about it at some point and why that happened. But it's gotten to the point now where Ben Solak, who does a great job for ESPN, just did a whole piece on all the guys out there who are in this purgatory state with their current teams and might get traded or might come back. And, you know, he did lead the Cooper Kupp one with, or I guess I should say he ended his Cooper Kupp write-up with saying the Steelers would be the right fit for him. I get it. He explains it well, and he suggested the ideal trade as being the Steelers getting Kupp and a 6th-round pick next year for the Steelers' 3rd rounder this year and a 4th rounder next year. Regardless of how you feel about that value, which I think could be fine, I've just heard some things. I don't think Cooper Kupp wants to come here. I think he's probably got his own short list, and, you know, the Rams owe it to him at this point that if they're going to move on, work with him to go somewhere he actually wants to go. And I think he would want to go somewhere with a little more established quarterback situation than what we just talked about for the first 15 minutes of the show. So beyond him, you know, Jaire Alexander from the Packers checks some boxes, position of need for the Steelers at corner, and he's a veteran. He's a good player, or at least he has been over the course of his career, an all-pro type, but he's also had some antics in Green Bay, which is why he's worn out his welcome there. And I think they've worn out they've run their course with him. I don't think he's happy there either, from what I read. I just don't know that I'd want to go down the road of someone who's been kind of problematic. And there's going to be other corners on the market this year. Jonathan Allen from the Commanders, I've been emailed from people about him. Again, D lineman who's been a above average starter in Washington for a while now, pedigree of a 1st rounder. He's had really productive years. However, he's now 30. He's got a huge cap hit, and he barely did anything last season. So while the name value would be nice, and if you could get him for cheap, maybe the Steelers have the salary cap room to withstand it. I don't know if you're really getting someone who's any better than Larry Ogunjobi at this stage. So that might be shuffling deck chairs. One who jumps out to me a little, Adam, and you didn't mention him, was Davon Godchaux of the Patriots. And not really a big name, but he's been a starter for them for a while. He's your classic, just big 2-gapping nose tackle. We've been talking ad nauseum about the Steelers adding somebody like that through the draft. If Godchaux is no longer a scheme fit in New England, he's not real expensive like a Jonathan Allen. He's a pretty seamless transition to another 3-4 base defense. Maybe the Steelers could be interested in him if the Patriots will, you know, accept relatively low draft compensation. And then I think you can throw out the idea of spending big money on one in free agency, and maybe you don't have to double down at that position in the draft.
Yeah, that's certainly something to monitor. I'll just add a couple of notes there. I remember we were talking about Cooper Kupp at the NFL trade deadline, and I said at the time, he's a guy that seems to work best with the volume. I think, you know, in that Super Bowl year with the Rams, he was catching 20 passes a game at times. He's not getting that many targets in the Steelers offense. It just never seemed like a fit,
because they just don't throw that much. But I mean, they do need somebody to throw to. We know that. Like their quote unquote possession receiver last year, I guess, was Van Jefferson, and I'll have to look it up. How many catches do you think he had last year, Adam?
Not a bunch.
He was doing cardio most weeks out there.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, I can imagine why he would help, but it's just that I don't know why he would want to come here if he knows that he's not going to get the volume. And I even had this thought about Devontae Adams after watching the receiver documentary and him talking about how important it was for him to get the ball a lot, to get in a rhythm, and how he almost viewed himself as the CEO of the Raiders, you know, during that time. At least that was how the show presented it. That's not happening here. So I've never really bought into that. I do like the idea of Jaire Alexander a little bit if you can get, you know, some of that discord sorted out that he's got in Green Bay, because we saw what happened when they didn't get Patrick Peterson when they wanted him years before he ended up coming to the Steelers. This would be a situation where you want to get this guy now. You want to sign him, you know, when he's on the other side of the hill, you know, so to speak. So I'm intrigued by those couple guys. But I did want to ask you this
question. He's only 28. He just turned 28, and he's probably only a year or two removed from being on people's short list of best corners in the NFL.
Yeah, no, you could still get him for a chunk of his prime. That's why I would be intrigued by that.
He's been hurt a lot too. That's the last thing I'll mention on him. It's not just showing up late for work and getting suspended for a game in-house and wearing sunglasses during interviews and saying weird stuff. He's also legitimately had injury concerns.
Yes. Brian, I also wanted to ask you just generally about the idea of giving up draft capital for this team, though, because I think the trade conversation is one you have for a finishing piece ultimately. Yeah. And I don't know that the Steelers are in a finishing piece position. I think they've had that mindset for a long time, and it hasn't worked out in the form of Minkah Fitzpatrick and some other guys. So my view is that you want to build a little bit more broadly with the draft, and you have money to spend in free agency. How can you spread those dollars to make the whole roster better rather than putting all your eggs in one basket?
I would definitely hesitate to deal away draft capital. I mean, I just think that it's not even so much that there are so many roster holes for this team, but like there's just so many areas on the roster where they need to replenish and get younger and start building for the future. They've been hanging on now for guys who are, don't get me wrong, still really good and productive players, but they're not going to be here forever. And some of the middle tier depth is lacking on this team because of some of the middle round whiffs that they've had in the draft. Let's just be honest about that. So rather than try to correct those issues by saying we're just not going to make as many mid-round picks, I would instead posit try to make better picks rather than dealing them for aging players. So I mean, again, with like a guy like Godchaux, if the price is right and you feel like he's pretty much filling a need that you would look to the draft for anyway, I could understand that, but no, I don't see the Steelers, blowing up mortgaging the future at all for guys like a Cooper Kupp or Deebo Samuel or anything like that. So we'll see. I mean, I guess the more names that hit the NFL trade market here, Adam, the players might be cannibalizing themselves and eating into their own value with other teams, and you might raise your eyebrows at how little some of these guys end up going for if they do indeed get moved.
Yeah. Brian, we got a couple other questions I wanted to get to just real quickly. Did you have any thoughts on the Myles Garrett drama? First, there was a report yesterday that he was willing to stay with the Browns. That was quickly turned around. So that seems like a messy situation up there. And then closer to home, you have the Steelers, where I think a lot of us thought that the Najee Harris book was closed. Our own Jerry Dulac reporting that they're still talking and that door is not necessarily closed. Did you have any thoughts on either of those topics before we get into Combine?
I mean, Myles Garrett, just quickly, like the Browns is the Browns. They have some sort of curse and hex on that organization. They finally get like the savior and hero for the city. And now he wants out too. So that's brutal. I mean, much like Deshaun Watson, no easy, clear path forward there for them. Good luck to Andrew Berry and company with dealing with that whole sideshow. Naji, I don't blame the Steelers for continuing to keep open that line of communication for a 4-year, 1,000-yard rusher who almost never fumbles, always plays. And I mean, I think his desire to win and desire to prepare to win is probably right up there with anybody on this team. But that doesn't mean that he's a low maintenance guy. I think he's also kind of a big personality to deal with. And even if you're Naji in the the Steelers, if they're going to sign him for more than his 5th-year option would be, I mean, that's essentially admitting that they made a mistake. And I don't think they're really in the habit of doing that, nor are many NFL teams. If you're Naji, you're going to take less than that. I mean, that's just, just take a step back. I mean, with anybody, with any employer, if you guys have kind of disagreed over your value and worth to the company, probably going to be pretty tough to get back on the same page when you sit down. So, I mean, I've said many times on the show and written and elsewhere, like, I think he probably wants a change of scenery and a fresh start. Doesn't hurt if his agent can get more out of the Steelers, and, money talks and money makes that change of scenery not so great. And if you're the Steelers, doesn't hurt to kind of save face and say, hey, look, like, we tried, we did what we could. We respect Naji and thank him for everything he did here for 4 years. It wasn't a bad first round pick or anything, but just didn't work out long term the way either one of us would want. So my guess is still that he's not back, but that is somewhat interesting that the door is ajar no matter how slightly.
Going to be interesting to watch how that plays out. Brian, we're going to be back with a quick segment here on the NFL Combine, some of the Steelers' activities there. Before we do, just want to thank our friends over at Moon Honda. Here's a message from them.
We gave the all-electric Prologue EX class-leading passenger space. And we made its tech intuitive with Google built-in. Perhaps that's why we were named Best Overall EV and Hybrid Brand by Kelley Blue Book. It's nice when a dream comes together. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
We are back, third segment on a Friday here in the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm Adam Bittner in for Christopher Carter, joined by Brian Batko. We're talking Steelers at the NFL Combine. Been meeting with a lot of players. Formal interviews is what they often call them, Brian. And I think that implies that they're a lot more serious and probing than maybe they are in reality. I often tell people that sports in general, and I think the NFL certainly falls in this category, are a lot more like your own job than you probably would like to think. They're not as much like the Billy Bean, in Moneyball type of stuff with Brad Pitt and the swashbuckling. It's a lot of job fairs and networking, and that is sort of what the NFL Combine is. What is your read on these pre-Combine interviews and how much we should look into who the Steelers are or are not talking to?
Very little, honestly. I just think I've heard, or I've seen stuff from too many people who are either in the league or have been in the league and part of this process that it really does not matter, because you've got so many opportunities to have meetings of various sorts with players, from the Senior Bowl to the Combine to their pro days to bringing them in on the 30 visits. I think the top 30 visits, which is a bit of a misnomer, but the 30 that you're allotted to bring players to your facility and really spend a day with them, like that to me is a lot more meaningful than a formal or informal or non-interview at the Combine. And then there's numerous cases of players who get drafted and they think, I barely even talked to that team. I didn't know they were interested in me. Or the flip side of I really thought I was going to this city because I had so many great meetings with them. There's just so much that can change. There's also two schools of thought of, okay, Mike Tomlin's really doing his homework on Quinn Ewers from Texas. And it's would you want the rest of the world to know that you might want to draft Quinn Ewers in the, let's say, 4th round so that the teams in front of you either trade up or pick him before you? No, it doesn't. It also doesn't make sense to broadcast and telegraph what you want to do. Now, sometimes those desires kind of conflict, because the Steelers also don't necessarily mind being pretty open and honest about what position groups they're scouting and who they're looking at. It's not like you sit down with people that you have zero interest in just to throw people off the scent. But no, I think it's mostly pointless to detail all of those. And the one caveat that I would have is, if a player happens to say something particularly pointed about a meeting with the coach or what he asked about or what they may have told him. But by now, I think all these prospects are savvy enough that they're not going to get into that. And a lot of, more and more, like Travis Hunter kind of made waves for doing this the other day, is they're not even telling the media who they do and don't meet with, because again, I think it's pointless.
Brian, I do know that there was some buzz around the Steelers meeting with Tyler Warren from Penn State. I think that's kind of goes with the territory of being a Pennsylvania team, interviewing the Pennsylvania guy who kind of made that program go this year. But they met with a few other tight ends as well. Mitchell Evans of Notre Dame was on that list. Is tight end on your roster at all in terms of what they're going to do? Because you have Darnell Washington, you have Pat Freiermuth. It doesn't look like a position of need, but they are still talking to some of these guys.
I think only if it's a good player who might slip to day 3 of the draft, and then you're just kind of going, trusting the talent, and we'll find a place for him somehow, some way. Especially with Arthur Smith as your offensive coordinator, you can never really discount the notion of bringing in a tight end. Even 2 years ago, I mean, when they took Darnell Washington in the 3rd, I don't think on paper it was anywhere near the Steelers' top positions of need, but they just thought that was a player they couldn't pass up at that spot. So, yeah, I mean, wouldn't roll it out. Tyler Warren in the first round, that seems like a pipe dream, not only him making it to the Steelers, but also they making the decision to kind of sidestep some of these other more glaring needs to get what at that point, like a compliment to Pat Freiermuth, a new number one, and relegate the guy you gave an extension to last year to sort of number two in the pecking order. Now I know tight ends can and would play together often, but that just seems like something of a stretch to me. But hey, if you're the Steelers, you meet with Tyler Warren, there's a 5% chance he's on the board when you pick, and do your due diligence. Also, a lot of the times these players are going to be free agents in 4 and 5 years. And you say, okay, I remember that guy, our face-to-face sit down in Indy. It went great or it went terrible. And we want no parts of him at this stage. So I don't think they're going to meet with Shadur Sanders and Cam Ward or guys like that. But, pretty much everybody else, yes, like I said, do their due diligence. And even if it's not for this draft, there's a reason why Mike Tomlin sees Chase Young on the sideline and they're chopping it up like old buds, because he's been around these guys in various forms and fashions for many years.
Were there any names, Brian, that perked your ears up when you saw that the Steelers met with them? Maybe somebody said, let me Google this guy, find out what his deal is, either at any of those positions of need that we've talked a lot about, like defensive tackle and running back and wide receiver, or any other position?
I mean, not really. I'm looking way more at what guys are doing in the athletic testing at this point at the combine. They are not meeting with formal or informal, but I mean, yeah, so far, I mean, the data that we have as we're recording, a little afternoon on Friday, and as always, the caveat that, someone's 40 time is not going to supersede their production or what they actually put on film in college. But Landon Jackson, big defensive end from Arkansas, 6'7", I think, and he like a 40.5-inch vertical jump. He's somebody who, hey, if the Steelers strike out on some of these early defensive tackles, the big three that we're going to talk about on the mock draft tracker this weekend, Kenneth Grant, Walter Nolan, and Derek Harmon, if you are forced to dip into that position group on the second day of the draft, I don't know, maybe somebody like Landon Jackson, he's kind of a tweener. He's not quite a D end. He's not quite an edge rusher. He does stand up. He does drop in coverage at times. But could he bulk up and maybe play that like 5 technique for the Steelers? I don't know. I think the athletic profile is intriguing for sure. Also, interesting note about him, he has alopecia if you look up Landon Jackson. And for whatever weird coincidence, the Steelers cornered the market on those guys between Josh Dobbs and Ryan Shazier. So that would be kind of an interesting draft story twist. Shamar Stewart, it is canon that Ray Fittipaldo's first 2025 mock draft pick for the Steelers was Shamar Stewart, the big D end out of Texas A&M. Similar in that he would have to put on some weight. He actually dropped weight for the combine and went out and ran. I think it ended up being clocked at a 4.58 40 at like 6'6". I want to say he ends up in like the 260 range. I mean, you have to be bigger than that if you're going to be a base end for the Steelers, but man, he put on a show Thursday for sure.
Yeah, he sure did. Brian, thanks for joining me this week. You did tease our Sunday episode well. Brian and I will be back with our Steelers mock draft tracker, talking a lot more about these defensive tackles that the Steelers could look at, getting into the running back market with Amarion Hampton a little bit, talking a little bit about Will Howard, a name that came up again this week, pretty high on your quarterback big board, Brian, on postgazette.com. So still plenty to talk about. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Christopher Carter will be back on Monday. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. And we will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.